links to a lot of material arrangements, I would say. And the moment this became more embodied and more holistic, and we were more really experimenting physically and also becoming vulnerable, the framing changed. So framing from something, how this is good for me and helping me, towards something, how this is useful for the group. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think there's something that, that then different kind of practices are becoming possible because of having these joint framing sessions at the beginning. Yes.
Did you see a role of boundary objects in that process as well? I mean, because I didn't know if I understood you correctly, if I heard you, but you said that the material arrangement at first were somehow not so important than later. But I mean, what is the reason? Because I think many of us here in the room might argue, look, we use all these material arrangements and the objects, and I think that's what Henrik will also promote in just a second, right? The artifacts in between who might help us to establish this intentionality or the connection. Are you telling a different story here, or?
No, sorry. Yeah, we didn't look at the artifact as such. I was really sloppy in the terminology here. I haven't considered the role of the material arrangement as such in the research settings so far. So I would need to think about this quite a bit. Yeah, we were looking a lot about what connects people and what explains their investment in the practice that we were seeing. Whether this is more cognitive, whether it's emotional, whether this is habitual, or whether this is more intentional. So, and this is kind of where we come from. Yes.
Mariska, go ahead, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Steffen. This is great, and it's a paper that I'm working on with your research setting being a period of crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how this joint intentionality might work in non-crisis context, or I guess we're always in crisis, but where the crisis isn't so poignant, that might motivate.
Yeah, so in the chapter, as I said before, so looking at the experiment that we did, or the project on nanocellulose in Finland, I would say that's a non-crisis context. Maybe the term here would be whether there's a high degree of environmental uncertainty. And yes, the disaster studies, there's complexity, uncertainty, chaos, and so on. And in other settings, like in typical research project that you might have with industry collaboration, that's not the uncertainty. There's more in not knowing what's happening. And I really don't think that there is a difference in the sense that it's not the uncertainty in the external environment that would make the practices as such different. It is more about what are your own reasons of why you are engaging in the practice. That's at least my take. That's why I didn't feel it was difficult to rewrite and reinterpret what we had seen, whether this is in studying food corps in Europe, or like the industry collaboration, or studying post-disaster situations. So I think this is broadly applicable to any context, because it's focusing on experiences of sociality. And obviously in the disaster context, you have this chaos and complexity and disruption aspect. But besides that, why people feel triggered, these are the same emotional processes. So could you specify the question a little bit, if that's possible?
I think you addressed it. Thank you. I was just wanting to know more how you saw this in a crisis and non-crisis event.
Yeah. So in the chapter, what we do is, maybe this is a different answer, is Tuomela and colleagues, they are quite mathematical sometimes. You can almost develop formulas how to approach a situation. So if you can answer questions like, is it my intention I do this because somebody else has the intention to do this? Or am I doing this only because I feel I belong to the group, or are we both doing this because I know we are part of the group? So I know the other person is doing this because he or she feels belonging to the group. So we are doing this as a functional group agent of the group. Then you can get an answer whether you're talking about shared intentionality, joint intentionality, or we intentionality. And I think this is sometimes actually quite helpful to approach the practices you might be seeing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question.
Stefan, I think I'm reflecting on something we're doing at where I am. I'm wondering if you observe, or maybe if we could observe, is that different level of intentionalities or different types? I think it's around that level. Do they give different practice to give birth to different practices, or is it always shared practices at the end, or maybe something you haven't considered?
We didn't consider whether it's possible to do certain practices with different kind of intentionality, but we were thinking that a lot of the joint actions we are observing, they would require joint or we intentionality to be in place. So a lot of the stuff, a lot of the practices around sustainability or grand challenges, they can't be done by individuals not working together. I mean, I don't believe in this one person will fix the world. So we see like people working together in solving these problems in a certain context, and that would require the joint or we intentionality. So I think the practices that, for instance, are oftentimes related to grand challenges, climate change solutions on I mean, the social practices, not the technological developments, the social practices, they would require joint or we intentionality. So I guess you could say that with just shared intentionality, you wouldn't be able to do something in this respect, because it would be falling apart in the moment that you are, for instance, no longer seeing each other, or other priorities come into play. You wouldn't feel yourself being a function, like representing the group in other instances. And because of that, you wouldn't be conducting the practice.
That's interesting, because that's telling us how practice becomes sustainable in this framework anyway, or non-sustainable. Is that about what I'm understanding? So how durable and how sustainable, how durable, how practice endure in time or not, basically.
Yes, this is an argument we wanted to make with the chapter, basically saying that in order to understand entrepreneurship as sustainable practice, you would need we intentionality. And it's not just intentionality. I mean, we left it out, but there is like the strongly collective emotions that are directly tied to we intentionality. So it is that you feel this, what we do in the Haiti chapter on collective emotions, that you feel it's not just being empathetic towards somebody, but it's like this strong sense of solidarity towards each other across situations. So yeah, this is something we would like to postulate, and that maybe can be explored further.
I have empirical data for you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's super interesting. Thanks for your time. Unfortunately, we have to, well, fortunately or unfortunately, move on to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you for having me, and yeah, best of success with the remaining part of the conference.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, then I think next on the agenda is Henrik Berglund. Professor Henrik Berglund from Chalmers Institute of Technology in Sweden. And I think you're here, right, Henrik?
I'm here.
The stage is yours.
Okay, let's see how to share the screen then. I think I'll do this portion of screen version here, so bear with me for a few seconds. So I can see all you lovely people at the same time. So, whoops. Does that look okay for you guys?
Now we see it well.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, thanks for doing this. This was a nice way of you know, launching the book and everything. So yeah, the name of the paper is, or the book chapter is The Artifacts of Entrepreneurial Practice. And I haven't written it myself. It's co-authored with Vern Glaser from University of Alberta, who is not with us, but who definitely contributed quite a lot. I tried to stick with what you told us to do, or told me to do, and have a one slide summary. But I added lots of stuff to that one slide, so it's good to have 10 minutes to go through it all. So basically, the whole idea of this paper is to say something about the kind of central artifacts of entrepreneurial practice. And the thing is that the whole entrepreneurship as practice community or movement, or whatever you want to call it, it's supposed to focus on these things and to contribute to practice and all that. But it's a bit strange then, I think, that there is relatively little focus on kind of the central artifacts of entrepreneurial practice. I mean, the artifacts that the entrepreneurs actually design, and since they're quite central in what entrepreneurs do, everything from business model canvases to business plans to prototypes to simulations to user experience experiments, etc. The fact that they are so common and so central makes it a bit strange that they're not more common in the research field. And I think the previous presentation was a bit of an illustration of that. No, we didn't look at artifacts. It's mostly about things like practices and routines and emotions and we intentionalities and that type of thing. That's extremely useful, I think. But if one looks at entrepreneurship, and if one perhaps defines entrepreneurship as the design of some sort of new organization or some sort of new world or business or product, then these things become quite important, I think. So this is a quote from the chapter. There's this traditional critique of economics that entrepreneurship is like the Prince of Denmark in Hamlet in the economics textbooks, as if he was missing from Hamlet. It's a pretty central character to the economy, the entrepreneur. And our argument is that these kind of entrepreneurial artifacts are basically like Hamlet in the story of entrepreneurship as practice. A bit kind of over the top perhaps, but it's such a nice quote that we thought we'd try to use it again. So moving on, what we do in the paper or in the chapter is one of the contributions, I think, is that we try to define something that we call an entrepreneurial artifact, try to kind of introduce and establish that concept. And we define that as any artifact that serves to instantiate an abstract opportunity in a way that supports its further development. And that might need a bit of unpacking. We here think of opportunity, not in perhaps the traditional sense of either something that exists out there, there is some sort of conjunction of fortuitous forces in the world, market demand and available technology and funding, whatnot, that constitutes an opportunity that someone can kind of discover or exploit. Nor do we think of opportunity as something that is purely kind of subjective. Someone imagines something and that's the opportunity. These two are the kind of traditional perspectives, I would say, in the entrepreneurship fields, that they're either subjective or objective. Instead, we actually define opportunity as an artifact. We say that, okay, let's not say that opportunities are subjective or objective. Let's say that they're artificial. They're designed things. Individuals design them in a context in the world. So that's what we mean here. And then what we mean by entrepreneurial artifacts are all those things that I showed you before, all those prototypes, business plans, business model canvases, simulations that actually in one way or another try to instantiate, try to illustrate, try to concretize this kind of abstract artifact that you're trying to design, this venture, this startup, this business. We don't have to use opportunity word for this most abstract thing. It could just as well be startup or be venture or be perhaps organization, but we went with opportunity here. And in addition to defining, trying to introduce this concept and say that, okay, these are a very particular kind of artifacts. And perhaps I should just take a step back and just say, one way to think about these entrepreneurial artifacts is to perhaps distinguish them from these more kind of peripheral artifacts that practice scholars often pay a lot of attention to, like you know, chairs and tables and the meeting rooms and you know, video conferencing equipment. Those are not instantiations of the kind of basic opportunity that you're trying to design. Those are just environmental, you know, circumstances that happen to be material, but and happen to be artifacts, but they are not entrepreneurial artifacts the way we define them, if that makes things clear. So in addition to just generally defining this concept, we also propose a typology of these entrepreneurial artifacts, a kind of useful way to categorize them. Now, all such typologies, I think, are a bit arbitrary, and I think the value or the truth of them kind of lies in their value. And we think this is a useful way to kind of subdivide these entrepreneurial artifacts that allow us to kind of talk about them in a productive way. And I think also allows entrepreneurs to work with them in a productive way. So I think these are meaningful, but they're open to revision, of course. So the first entrepreneurial artifact that we talk about is an abstract artifact, which we talk about as conceptual devices that help entrepreneurs develop theories of their ventures. And this can be, you know, a business model canvas could be such an abstract artifact, or a business plan could perhaps be that as well. But you know, these entrepreneurial theories that Feline and Sanger and others talk about, that people try to kind of articulate in different ways. We also have material artifacts, kind of the things where the kind of material substance, the kind of materiality of them are central to their function. It's not just an abstract kind of conceptual device. It's something that actually has materiality, and that's important. And an example here could be, you know, just a physical prototype and a digital kind of landing page, or a digital simulation, or a digital demonstration, or something like that. So those are subcategories of these material artifacts then. And then finally, we also talk about what we call narrative artifacts, which we then define as more sense-making devices, you know, not defined by the material kind of substrate or anything like that, but it's kind of the narrative qualities, the ability to relate things into coherent accounts, meaningful accounts that are core to them. That's the defining characteristic. Now, of course, any particular little thing that an entrepreneur works with will perhaps blend all of these. You know, you have a business model that's an abstract artifact, which you instantiate in a kind of whiteboard, which is a physical thing, and you do that telling a story about the venture, which is kind of more of a narrative thing. But I think as types, as categories, I think these three make sense. So we discuss these and illustrate these and have plenty of examples of them, and also talk about how they might be mixed and matched in various situations as well. And then we say a few words about how this idea of researching entrepreneurial practice with focus on these entrepreneurial artifacts might be developed going forward. And first, we say a few words about artifacts and the role they play in experimental and transformational processes. And this harks back to these two categories, or two types, experimentation and transformation. I mentioned with two of my PhD students in a paper that was published 2 years ago in the Academy of Management Review. So it's just two basic modes of entrepreneurship that we call experimentation and transformation. I won't go into too much detail on what they mean, but it's basically, one is more Popperian hypothesis testing, the other one is more kind of co-creative, emergent, flat hierarchy kind of thing. We also say that talk about how regarding artifacts as epistemic objects might be valuable. It's a concept developed by especially, I think, Karin Knorr-Cetina, but Reinberger and a few others have used similar concepts. And there you talk about the importance of artifacts in knowledge production processes more generally, typically science and engineering and advanced knowledge-based services. and they have some interesting things to say about artifacts and the role they play in knowledge kind of production and the innovation processes that I think could be valuable for taking this idea forward. And also we say a few words about how it's meaningful to contextualize or kind of place these artifacts in broader circumstances and assemblages, and situate them like that. And you can borrow from actor network theory or the philosophy of technology or other fields to say things about that, but that embeddedness and looking at them in the kind of systemic context is important as well. And that's the chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? I have many. Rohan, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Henrik. Very, very interesting. So actually, I was curious about how you look at sort of Norsetina's epistemic objects and this concept of entrepreneurial artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question that came to my mind when you spoke about artifact was, are these just objects, or can you even call them an object? So how would you differentiate between this notion of the epistemic object versus what you're calling an entrepreneurial artifact? Is it like more broader? Is it more related to entrepreneurship? I'm just curious on differentiate.
Well, I think almost by definition, epistemic object is intended to be a more general concept. I'm talking about entrepreneurship here, which is kind of fairly, I mean, it depends on how you define entrepreneurship as well. Entrepreneurship can be everything too.
Yes.
But so perhaps we shouldn't be so modest. Perhaps we should try to subsume everyone else under entrepreneurship. No, but I think I mean the way I look at the relationship between these two concepts is that the idea of epistemic things or epistemic concepts is reasonably well developed. It's been talked about before, and if I read those papers and those books, I see interesting and valuable insights that I can borrow into my more domain specific project of developing useful theory in the field of entrepreneurship. You can borrow it from lots of different areas to build a more domain specific theory, I think. So I think in this book chapter and in other papers I've written on kind of relating to these ideas in general, we use ideas from like boundary object that we mentioned before, the way like these artifacts can function, have a communicative kind of and mediating role in that sense. I've become extremely interested in philosophy of technology for the last year or so, reading Don Ide and Peter Paul Verbeek and all those people who talk about technology, not just in the context of technoscience and mediating the work of scientists as they try to get access to the natural world, but more generally the role they play in design and in shaping who we are as individuals. I put on a pair of glasses, I kind of see the world differently, and different gauges and thermometers and things like that give me a different kind of access to the world. And I think there are lots of disciplines and areas, not just Norsetina's talk of epistemic objects, that contains useful conceptual machinery that we can borrow as we build our own little tools. And that's the way I think at that relationship. You can import and use stuff as you build your own theories in your own particular domain.
So just one thing that I noticed was the overall ontology, which is about basically the role of subjects as well, along with the epistemic object, that is very specific in Norsetina. But here, I think you can incorporate much sort of wider versions of how subject-object interaction happens.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You don't have to sort of stick to that ontology saying that it's always subject-object interaction that creates practice. You have all sorts of.
No, I think absolutely. I think, and that's why it's interesting and important, I think, to reflect on how we borrow theories. There are things that I want to do when I build my theories that Karin Norsetina is not interested in doing and hasn't done for that reason, perhaps. And the same goes for these philosophers of technology that I mentioned before. And it goes for someone like Latour, who talks about all these different chains of individuals and artifacts. And, it's too complex for me. I don't need that. So I mean, you take what you need in order to do what you have to do. And I think, but I also think that entrepreneurship as a context and as a practice has certain kind of aspects to it that go beyond what I think has been done by anyone in any other, because it's about designing something new. It's about, you know, you design new kind of artifacts, new systems, and by doing so, you basically kind of disclose new worlds, to speak with Heidegger. And I think understanding that process is not something that too many other fields are trying to do in that direct sense, which is why I think it's interesting to engage in.
Right. Thank you.
So I'm moderating here. Then I see Inge Hill has raised her hand.
Yeah, Inga was first and then Sherry.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
I'm not going to moderate anymore. Someone else take over.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Super interesting. I have some short questions. I was struggling following your definition. Maybe if you could, that of entrepreneurial artifact, could reword that. That would, for me, be really helpful. The other questions are linked. I didn't quite get the conceptualization as being in any way relational. I heard critical realism, but I might have missed something.
Yeah, definitely.
How does what you do link to the materiality discussion in OS and other disciplines, which is kind of the material turn, so to say, has been happening for a number of over a decade in other disciplines. And that was ringing in my ear when I listened to your presentation.
So the question is, you didn't really get our definition of entrepreneurial artifact, or?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, what the whole kind of idea of an artifact here means. I mean, this I told you before that traditionally, you know, much of the entrepreneurship field has been kind of structured by this individual opportunity nexus. You know, Venkataraman and Shane and those people, taking that from Hayek and Kirchner and Schumpeter and economists. And in that world, there are no artifacts, basically. There are individuals and market opportunities. So an opportunity is defined by some sort of disequilibrium situation that you can exploit for profit, implicitly by introducing some sort of business or product, but that's not core to the theorizing. So there is no artifact in that framework, as far as I can see, at least. So what we're trying to do in this book chapter and in other works is to kind of say that individual environment, which is that nexus, that's what that nexus basically comprises. It's the individual opportunity nexus is individuals and market disequilibria, basically. You know. And we're saying that that's not enough to understand entrepreneurship. We need to have, you know, the thing that entrepreneurs actually create, that they design as part on equal footing with the individual and the environment. And so that's how we define artifact. In a very abstract sense, we say that the most abstract way to talk about that thing which entrepreneurs design, we choose to call that the opportunity. You might as well, you know, if you're in Silicon Valley, you will call it the startup, you know, the startup, right? That's a common term for that thing which entrepreneurs design. If you're an entrepreneurship scholar like Per Davidsson or someone else, you want to call it the venture or something else. But that kind of abstract entity that entrepreneurs design, that are neither themselves nor the environmental circumstances in which they operate, but that thing that they design. So that's the artifact. And then we say that, okay, in addition to this very kind of super abstract way of conceptualizing things, we subdivide that into what we call entrepreneurial artifacts. And those are the ways in which that kind of abstract thing, you know, is kind of reified, is instantiated in different ways, is materialized in such a way that it allows you to develop it further. So that's basically the definition.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Shari, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you very much, Henrik. Excellent presentation, even though you were required to do just one little slide.
Where are you?
Topic. I just have a quick boundary question. In terms of the artifacts, where do you draw the line between the simulations, the prototypes, and then the final product or service that's now sold en masse?
Yeah. That's a nice question, and I think there are lots of ways to, a few ways to answer that. It's not something we talk about in the book chapter, but I think echoing what Raghu said this morning when he had his talk about performativity, I think it's an easy kind of cop out to that question is to say that things never stabilize, right?
Right.
I think Raghu even wrote a really nice paper. I think it was in organization studies or science, no studies, a couple of years ago about I can't remember the title. It's a really nice title. It's like you know, your product is never finished. You know, it's continuously evolving, and that's the way we need to think about products. I mean, they used examples like Wikipedia or Linux and other kind of software artifacts that are intended to be continuously developed and never stop. But if you look at a car these days, if you look at the Tesla automobile, for instance, when is it finished? I mean, it's continually developing. So I don't think that's, in those contexts at least, it's not a super important question to ask. And it's difficult to draw a sharp line. But in general, I would say that I'm more interested in the actual process than any end state, even if there is one. Yeah.
Okay, I was just concerned that maybe we then start bumping up against, you know, more traditional research in the R&D field, in the entrepreneurship area, and are we now polluting the artifact construct by not clearly defining it? But it sounds like it's still TBD. We'll be discussing.
Yeah.
Right,
I'm bumping up against those people all the time, and I love it. You know, I'm at the technical university. I mean, I have product designers and computer scientists all around. So that's how I think of these things, and I think it's probably partly because of, you know, having an engineering background that I tend to think of entrepreneurship also in these terms, that it is about actually building stuff.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
thank you.
It's quite natural to me to bump up against the product people. Yeah.
Yeah, please go.
Hey, Henrik.
Hey.
This is another Berglund from Sweden.
Karin.
So yeah, very interesting.
Wait a minute. I'm alone at home and someone is pounding the door. Like 20 seconds.
Hybrid, I love that. Where are you when you have a hybrid conference? Where are you really? Yeah. You are everywhere and nowhere.
He gets flowers now. From you.
Yeah.
That would be a surprise.
That would be a surprise. That would be another element of things.
Sorry about that. That's my brother fetching his ski gear from my trunk. Yeah.
Priorities.
Yeah, it's really interesting to follow your discussion. I was thinking in terms of what happens from your conceptualization when the entrepreneurial object is not an artifact. And could you think about that in particular from a power dimension?
What could you give an example? I'm not sure I follow really.
If we think about Schumpeter, he talked about the combinations. And I think today when we are facing these kind of other challenges, in particular, we've talked about sustainability, etc., etc. It's a lot about organizing in new ways where there is not a particular artifact that can solve the situation. We know the discussion in sustainability is that we have all the technology. We just need to do this. And I was thinking about how we can acknowledge these kind of entrepreneurial objects as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think some sort of social system could very well be an artifact that you design. I mean, again, these are conventions and definitional questions in a certain sense. You know, how broadly do you want to stretch entrepreneurship, and how broadly do you want to, stretch or apply the concept of artifact? If you talk about sustainability and building coalitions in like multinational or global coalitions to legislate. Okay, you might talk about that in terms of artifacts, I guess. You might talk about that in terms of entrepreneurship. I'm not sure, you know, if that's, yeah.
If you think about it just as a service or a function.
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be problematic, I think. A service, you could, I mean, you have some sort of business that you want to create, or some sort of organization, some sort of solution that you want to sell to a customer for profit, I assume, when you say service. You know, it's someone is delivering that. It might be an organization. You might have some sort of tools for doing it. You might have all kinds of things. And those I would definitely call artifacts. Again, those types that I mentioned, the more abstract and the material and the narrative, might not be sufficient to speak to that in sufficient detail. So perhaps it needs to be broadened. And I agree with the former speaker. This is to be done in many ways. This is like the first or second paper that I've talked about these things and tried to develop this notion, and it's far from finished. I think these kind of very broad categories of abstract, material, and narrative capture a lot, and they are very general. But I think they might probably lack precision to be able to speak to perhaps service design and service businesses. So I wouldn't mind if you contributed a little bit and said something about that. I have a journal.
Yeah, because that, I mean, if I'm just going to think out loud together with you, that selling an artifact or having kind of a technology makes it so much easier. But if you are to sell, although we talk about perhaps within public organizations or whatever, if it's a way of organizing society or an organization in a new way, it's so much more difficult.
Yeah, but again, I think that it's a question of how broadly you want to, you know, define the notion of entrepreneurship. If you want to have organizational change be entrepreneurship, sure, perhaps. I again, perhaps because of my background and being at the technical university, I tend to think more of products and services being somehow, you know, things or experiences that are sold, not just organizational change or renewal. But perhaps I'm thinking too small. Perhaps I'm thinking too small.
No, but I think we can learn from you, or entrepreneurs in other contexts could learn from this, because I think this matters.
Yeah, no, but I think especially for services, I think there's definitely room for developing more kind of more conceptual tools to address that with a bit more clarity. And I would definitely welcome that type of work.
Thanks, Henrik. I wanted to add one thing to your proposals for opportunities for research, is that to add like a perceptual look at those ways that the artifacts feed into organizing practices, and the practices, you know, have an impact on the artifacts. And there's that go back and forth.
Processual, you call them?
Yeah, like the processual, or the relationships in a processual manner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of one practice, but that becomes an input for the next.
Right. I think in general that's how they typically work. Like you have a prototype or an MVP or whatever you want to call it, and the purpose of that is to lead to the next one, which is slightly more mature and advanced and elaborate. But perhaps what you have in mind is more a kind of scaffolding kind of thing that supports other development processes, or
it just becomes an object that's used in time as the next practice is engaged,
right,
or enacted. You know, and the outcome of one becomes the input of another, and it kind of artifact connects these practices. I mean, it's a traditional way of thinking about how objects connect practices in time and space.
Yeah. And I think in general, this is not something we wrote about in the book chapter, but I think in general, and again, speaking about importing ideas from other fields, but this whole idea of how various artifacts in relation to, of course, actors have certain affordances and enable certain things. That what you talk about definitely being a really important such affordance, that it can lead into a type of behavior that in turn will lead to another type of artifact, etc. So I think developing vocabulary for talking about those things, the affordances of artifacts and artifact relations to practices, I think is really interesting as well. And you can see how that develops very differently in different fields. So for instance, in information systems, they often talk about affordances in things that relate to this notion of we intentionality. An information system, a large information system, will have the affordance of allowing people to align and speak the same vocabulary and do things jointly, and they might have other affordances as well. And in product design, you have another vocabulary for thinking about affordances. You talk about the ability for a product like a smartphone or a microwave to give you feedback, to be intuitive, those types of things. And I think we would probably benefit from developing a vocabulary around entrepreneurial artifacts as well, and the affordances that they have. That would include what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Do we have time for one more? Are you okay, Henrik? We're a bit over time, but
that's fine. I have kids screaming as well. So,
all right, Thomas, go ahead. We'll end with you.
I think what you said, Neil, was quite interesting, because another way of looking at it, going back to CCO literature again, is to look at how these artifacts transpire and how they translocate and translocute and sort of become ventriloquists for what they were once.
Yeah.
So I mean, for instance, you could have a business model canvas at some point, but it might even impact other practices later on, not being a business model canvas, but still being sort of embedded, or having been embedded into the language that people use and the conversations that they use. Mm-hmm. So it still continues to influence the development of something, or the progression of it. It is still there, and it sort of slowly fades out and becomes into something else. And I think that's perhaps also interesting for us as a group to study and trace how these different artifacts become almost as if they change their shape and form over time.
I mean, that's I think, and this is also in line with the Karin Knorr-Cettina's notion of epistemic objects, that they have the affordance of inviting people to change them and to stimulate creativity and ask questions that will take you forward. If I heard you correctly in the beginning of your question, I saw traces of what Latour and others and these philosophers of technology also talk about, how you can sometimes delegate almost intentionality to an object, and objects also delegate their own kind of ambitions to you in a certain sense, and how those can linger on even after an individual has left. Like a speed bump, for instance, you delegate the job of not driving too fast outside the school to the speed bump, and that's there 24/7. So that type of relationship between individuals and artifacts, I think is relevant for entrepreneurship as well. But we need to think about it slightly differently, since it's a particular context.
Well, I found that extremely interesting. So thank you very much for your time, Henrik.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I need to go now.
Yeah.
So, bye-bye.
We'll see you tomorrow, I think.
Yeah, I'll be back. Thanks for having me.
Yep. And everybody here and also online, we'll just wrap it up. I think here at 5 o'clock, I think we were all heard a lot of great things.
Zoom now, we're not fully wrapping up, sorry.
Oh, right. We're wrapping up the conference part, but if you want to stick around with people on Zoom and chat, Inga is going to keep I'll make you a host, Inga, and you can keep the Zoom room open. So for those people that are wanting to be online and continue the conversation and share ideas for however long as you'd like, Inga will be hosting you as a online event. The in-person people will sign off and we'll reconvene for dinner, but I will handle that offline. Okay, clear?
Enjoy the dinner for us.
Microwave your own dinner tonight.
Tomorrow we want to see pictures and selfies and of what you have for dinner.
I think it might be good as well, maybe tomorrow, if we introduce the people in the room, physically in the room, because we can see online who's present, do you know, and our names and everything, but it's difficult to see the room view from here, who's there. So maybe tomorrow that it might be nice to go around and introduce yourselves.
Yeah, we'll have time.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, that'd be lovely. Enjoy dinner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And hopefully sunshine. Okay, I don't think there is sunshine for some reason.
No, I interpreted it the same way.
Anyway, guys, so you're more than happy for you to